Okay, good evening, everybody. Shalom Aleichem, and thank you so much for joining. I am so incredibly impressed by the turnout this evening. Needless to say, really incredible show of commitment and participation, and really a pleasure to learn with you now until Nate's, I think, right? Sunrise is about I think it's about 5:30 or so. Just joking. Don't worry, I won't keep you that long. Especially because I hope that some of us, anyway, are still going to try to have as much of a Tikkun El Shavuos tomorrow night as possible. I know that I'm going to try my best, but that's all we can do. So, this last topic of discussion tonight, as you saw, hopefully advertised, I'd like to try to share a sampling of some of the most fascinating questions that have emerged over the past several months. A couple of months ago, I don't remember at what particular setting, at what point in time, I made the following comment, and you may or may not even have heard me say it, and perhaps you have heard others say this, or maybe you've come to the same discovery yourself. And that is that, of course, over the past several months, we have come to learn and discover a lot of things about life, about ourselves. And it goes without saying that some of the bravest and most dedicated and committed individuals that we have observed within our community, within the entire world, are medical professionals who have been working, on the quote-unquote front lines, having to put themselves in harm's way on a constant basis in order to treat and to help, and in certain situations to save and rescue others who are in need. And it goes without saying that we can and should continue to express our boundless hakar satov to these individuals within our community, and really, around the entire world. We should appreciate Mesiras Nefesh of this sort. There's another, I'm sure there are many other groups of individuals who deserve special recognition, but I think that within our community, as Torah observant Jews, we should appreciate that there is another group of individuals who have also been sort of on the front lines from day one, and those are the poskim. I don't necessarily mean the rabbis who are in positions where they are receiving questions. Of course, that's also a form of service, but individuals who are tasked with the challenge of having to field and then respond to questions, some of which are unprecedented. And even if they're not completely unprecedented, the circumstances that we face today are very unique. So while many have pointed out that, this is not the first pandemic in all of history, certainly not in Jewish history, there are tshuvas over the ages talking about different situations that come up, but because of the unique circumstances that we face today, because of opportunities and technological advancements that we have today, circumstances are unique, and some of the questions really require not just creative genius, but individuals who know how to extract, halachic principles, to take concepts that exist and to apply them to for those who were in my shir last night, to be Makayim, not just Kavati Itim LaTorah, but Papalta B'Chachma and Hivanta Davar Mitoch Davar. If you weren't there last night, then don't worry about that. But the idea is to be able to plumb the depths of Torah. If you were not aware, I'm going to tell you something right now, and that is that there are already, and actually some of them in different stages of publication, hundreds, probably thousands of responses that have been written over the past few months alone. Of course, overlapping questions and issues worldwide, although some very, very unique ones. There is a website. You don't necessarily need to go there now, but if you want, if you have a computer in front of you, you're welcome to. There's a website, I think it's Kol Corona, K-O-L, and then corona.org or .com, put together by Rabbi Ruvain, Rabbi Kevi Tarragon from Yeshivat HaKotel. And I think that website was set up probably within the first couple of weeks after the lockdown. And there is an incredible wealth of material there on many, many different resources. But there's a tab there that I think says Torah. It's not in front of me right now. And it will show you links to many, many other different places in which there have been collections of tshuvos. Some of them are in very, very short form. So they have literally thousands of questions that have been posed to poskim like Rabbi Schechter, Rabbi Willig, Rabbi Avigner, Rabbi Asher Weiss, Rabbi Ramon, and many others within the community. And it is just staggering to see the quantity of the questions as well as the quality of the response. So I think it's just Kedai, before we even start this conversation, to just appreciate that there is so much out there, and again, it's a credit to our community and to our poskim, not just that they have the capabilities of being able to do this. This, of course, is this is a havtacha, lo yamush hatorah mipi zarecha v'zera zarecha ad olam. We know that we have a havtacha that Torah will always remain with us and will be with us to escort us through all the challenges we have in life. But still, a tremendous amount of mesiras nefesh and dedication on the part of our poskim dealing with some of the most challenging questions. What I'd like to share with you tonight is a sample of them, and I'm specifically going to avoid dealing with some of the more, I would say, the more depressing shilas, and I'll give you examples of what I mean in a moment. There were some questions that, and I'm happy to give you sort of the marmakomas afterwards if you'd want to know where you can read about this. But tshuva is having to do with, having to choose. Let's say if you have one respirator, low lane between two people who need it. How is such a decision is to be made? Situations involving, issues having to do with death and cremation and some of the very very, very difficult and challenging situations. And it's not because they're not important, and it's all part of the story and the narrative of this particular, and I would say even ongoing crisis, although we hope that the worst is behind us. But I wanted to keep the questions a little bit on the lighter side tonight. We're going to be talking about heavy questions, but not quite that heavy. Now, one of the things that I noticed, I just went to that website today, Kol Corona, is that they link you to a website that is called Halachapedia, which is actually, that's an old site that's been around for a while and is constantly being updated. Really, really incredible place to go for marmakomas. I would never, ever recommend going there for psak, and I imagine there are probably disclaimers there telling you this is not where you should go if you have halachic shilas, but certainly if you're looking to research various topics, you can do so. So you'll see halacha related to the coronavirus, and just get a sense of the contents, and for the most part, they're presented over here in almost chronological order. If there's ever going to be a study about what's happened over the past few months, there's a certain story and how it progressed. So tefillah, obviously, parts of davening to skip as a subcategory, issues having to do with minyanim, netilas yadayim, early Shabbos davening, particularly when one's at home, hagomel, b'tikas chametz and beer chametz, selling chametz, buying for Pesach. This seems like a long time ago that we had. But you remember there were a lot of Pesach shalis that were unique to this year. Erev Tafshil and Erev Chatzeros, which are actually I'm going to share questions about that. Birchas Ilanos, Tanas Bechoros, Birchas Levan, etc. And then, I don't want to go through all this right now, but I just want you to see, some of the questions and the topics that appear. I'm just skimming through it very quickly. We're not really going to go through these right now, but if you could see it on the screen in front of you, there's a collection of Piskei Halacha, and each one of those footnotes at the end of each one of these halachos will take you to, some of the original sources. And if you look at any one of these, as I'm skimming through them, it may be a little hard to read, you'll see that, they really, there's such a range and a scope over here of different issues that have come up. I mean, I'm just looking randomly, right in the middle of the page. Ideally, one should recite Birchas Halavana outside. If one cannot do so, he may recite Birchas Halavana from inside, but initially one should open the window. Obviously, that's sort of a unique coronavirus, Shaila. It's not the first time anybody's ever asked that question, but we did find ourselves in a situation right now where, at least for certain individuals, maybe at certain points, it was unwise or unsafe for them to leave their house. Questions, of course, having to do with Shavuos, which is just around the corner. Mikvah Shailas, both in terms of Kela Mikvah and Mikvah for women. Questions having to do with preparation for tefillah, going to the shower after the tefillah, bris milah, naming a girl, pidyon haben, bar mitzvahs, weddings, etc. These, again, an ongoing list of different topics and issues. So I present this to you all as sort of way of introduction to tell you that what we're going to do tonight is just take a closer look at sort of a sample of some of the questions, just to appreciate the range. But before we look a little closer up, just to appreciate with greater perspective the scope of questions that have come up. And I would say one more thing before we begin the first question, and that is that it's not only a credit to our poskim who have been able to process and respond to these questions with incredible turnover. I mean, really, in lightning speed. But it's also a credit, and it's a testimony to the Jewish people that even in times, if not especially in times of great distress and challenge, so we are constantly adjusting and looking to calibrate as we need to in order to remain in sync with halacha and to be mekayim the various obligations we have to the best of our ability, and to avoid, or at least to mitigate, having to violate isurim, whatever the case may be. We have been inspired in the past when we have read about previous generations who have also had to face difficult times and circumstances and have asked questions which display incredible amount of heroism. I'm not going to say that this has been the most difficult and challenging time in all of Jewish history, or even in modern Jewish history, but in our lifetime this has been a difficult and challenging time. But just to know that we are going to bequeath now to future generations an entire library of questions and answers that have been produced, over the past few months alone, which is really, I think, I find that to be incredibly inspiring. Okay, the first question that I'd like to share with you, actually a very timely topic. You're going to receive an email at some point early tomorrow morning, reminding you that tomorrow you should prepare an Erev Tavshilin. Now we know that anytime Yom Tov precedes Shabbos, we prepare an Erev Tavshilin, which allows us to prepare from Yom Tov to Shabbos, and this is something that we should all do. Now, what's the Corona-related question? So this is really a question that has to do with rabbis in particular. What's the background over here? So the background is that each and every one of you, hopefully, in your homes tomorrow, as you would before any Shabbos, which is preceded directly by your Yom Tov, prepare an Erev Tavshilin. And what you're doing is you're preparing one on behalf of the members of your household. If you are a rabbi and you are responsible for a certain community, let's say, for example, if you're the rabbi of a shul, so in addition to making an Erev on behalf of the members of your household, you are also expected to recite or to make the Erev, prepare the Erev on behalf of members of the community who forget or forgot in that particular situation to prepare one. Now, there's an interesting halacha which is not part of this discussion. You get sort of like one strike and you're out. Everybody's allowed to rely on the rabbi once, but you're not really supposed to rely more than that. Really, everybody should prepare their own Erev, but the rabbi makes one and has other people in mind. It's not just about having other people in mind. The way this works, the way this is sort of executed, is somebody else from the community comes into the rabbi's house, and the rabbi, when preparing the Erev, literally hands the Erev over to this individual, who is then kona it, he acquires it on behalf of the other members of the community. There's an actual kinyan that takes place. Now, as I'm sure you could begin to appreciate, this past Pesach, when we prepared an Erev Tavshilin, and this is coming up again now, there are restrictions in place which may prohibit, or it may depend on circumstances in different cities and communities at this point, but certainly on Pesach over here, it would have been considered absolutely prohibited for somebody to enter, let's say, the rabbi's house in order so the rabbi can be makneh the Erev to him. So this was one of the first questions that was posed to Rav Shechter early on in this crisis, and what you see before you on the page is an actual short tshuva that was penned by Rav Shechter on this. Shana Zu, he writes, "B'chutz la'aretz, tzrichem erev tavshilin l'yom harishon shel Pesach." In Eretz Yisrael, they didn't need it for the first days because the first day of Pesach, as you recall, was Thursday, and we have a 2-day Yom Tov, which then went right into Shabbos. In Eretz Yisrael, obviously, it was Thursday, and then Friday was not a day of Yom Tov. But in Chutz La'aretz, we need an Erev Tavshilin. And it says in Shulchan Aruch, Arachaim Tov Kuf Chav Zayin, Shemitzvah Rav Ha'ir La'arev Al Bnei Iro Kedei Sheyismach Alav Misha Shachach. So anybody who forgets could rely on him. V'tzorach Lezakos, and the idea is that we, again, on behalf of members of the community, the pastor, the tavsha, whatever the case is, l'chol b'nei ir ayidei acherim. L'chadchila ein lezakos ayidei banav ketanim or afilu gedolim asmucham al shulchan aviyem v'gam lo ayidei ishto. The Shulchan Aruch says l'chadchila, one should not use members of his household, either his wife or children. The reason being because they are considered to sort of be extension of the rabbi's family, so that as opposed to being members of the community. The idea is that a member of the community, an outsider, can go ahead and can receive it on behalf of everyone in that group that he represents. And this is what we try to avoid when we can. However, and here comes sort of the punchline, but the there is an opinion in Shulchan Aruch that says, but the Eved, if there's no alternative, so we can rely on those opinions that say you can be makne the Erev to one of your children. So this past, or wife, it happens to be that this past Erev Pesach, so I was makne the Erev to my daughter Shira, and it was really the first time that I had ever done that with a member of my household. And she was first looking at me like, I'm strange, what are you doing? And then she remembered, oh, right, this is the thing that you do on Erev Yom Tov when you call somebody in from the outside. So it all sort of clicked for her that this particular year, right, Manashtana, Hashana Hazos, this year was different. Okay, so that's an interesting question. Another discussion over here that appears below has to do with the following, and that is that the basis to cook on Erev Shabbos, when it comes out on a Yom Tov, like it will actually on Friday. This Friday is the first day of Yom Tov Shavuos, and it's also Erev Shabbos. Now, the reason why we're permitted to cook in combination with the Erev Tavshilin is because there's a concept in the Gemara known as Ho'il Umekali Le'orchim. That maybe guests may arrive, and since they're going to arrive, I'm going to want to feed them on Yom Tov, and since I could prepare food for Yom Tov, so if this is left over for Shabbos, great. That's part of the halachic mechanism at play. Time doesn't allow right now to really explore that at great depth, but that's a concept that is known as ho'il, which literally means since. Now, of course, an interesting question that was raised this year is, wait a second, there is no ho'il mekalei orchim because I know nobody's coming to my house. I know nobody's coming to my house. Nobody's been to my house for three months. If anybody knocks on the door or rings the doorbell, so by the time you get there, they're standing 30 feet away at the street. There's nobody's coming over for a meal. There's nobody's coming over for a snack. And so there really is no ho'il. So therefore, you would think that there's no basis actually to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbos. It's a fascinating question because it goes to the very, very core of a very, very basic Talmudic principle, which up until this year, the question would have been inconceivable. If you would have asked me before 3 months ago, can you imagine a scenario in which the situation of Ho'il doesn't apply? I wouldn't have been able to imagine one. And here we had an entire community, really, an entire country and beyond, that was in the situation where it was impossible. Nobody can come. And this was a question that Rav Shechter dealt with as well. But he pointed out that there is a machlokes rishonim as to how we understand that principle of Ho'il, and at least according to some, there are other ways to understand it. And so therefore, in a situation like we find ourselves now, he was makel as well. Now, there's another interesting Erev-related question. We'll do this one quickly, and then we'll move on to another one, and that is the concept of an Erev Chatzeros. As you know, we have an Erev which allows us to carry around, let's say around our community. And when we talk about the Erev, we usually are referring to the actual let's say, the combination of poles and strings around the entire city. But in the most technical sense, that's actually not the Eruv. That's, we call it Tzuras HaPesach. There's another word for that. The Eruv is actually a box of matzah, which usually is in the shul. It's in Beth Aaron. We have a few of them around town. There's one in Beth Aaron, there's one in Rabbi Neuberger's house, and one other shul. I don't remember which. It's probably B'nai Yeshurun is my guess. Those are like the three places around town where you can find a meal. And that's actually the idea behind the Eruv, that in addition to the fact that there's a Tzuras HaPesach, there is, again, there's an enclosure which is combining all the different houses within the community. It's also, we have the ability to share something which could be used by anybody, a meal. So here you have an interesting situation. The shul is locked. Nobody can go to the shul. So nobody can access the Eruv. If nobody can access the Eruv, nobody should be able to carry on Shabbos. It's not even a Yom Tov question. It's a Dafka Shabbos question. So Rav Shechter said, it's not such a problem, because theoretically one could just take a key and open the shul in order to get the box of matzah. The reality is, you should know that the Eruv at the moment is actually in my house. I didn't take it from the shul, but we renew the Eruv each and every year on Pesach. And so therefore, it just so happens that I wasn't in shul on Erev Pesach, and so therefore it's here. So it's important that you know that. I did announce it to the shul a couple of months ago, but maybe not everybody heard it. So if you want to know where the Erev is, at least for the time being, it's in my house. Now Rav Shechter has another very interesting question over here regarding the recitation of Birchas HaGomel al derech Zoom. Another interesting situation is that you come up with a lot of new words that will that appear in the Hebrew Tshuvos that have been written, and you have to imagine, in a generation or two from now, they're going to be reading this. Levarich Birchas HaGomel derech. I have no idea what the word Zoom means, but we know what Zoom means. So Rav Shechter writes over here that the Mechaber teaches that l'chadchila, when a person recites Birchas HaGomel, it should be said in front of 10 people. It should be said in front of 10 people. Now, today, under these current circumstances, up until very recently, there was no discussion whatsoever. Now we're starting to have discussions about coming together in certain places at certain times in larger groups. But up until very recently, for several months now, the concept of having 10 people together, a minyan, it's a question whether you actually need a minyan or not, but certainly 10 people, so that was something that we couldn't imagine. On the other hand, you had people in the community who were thankfully recovering, Baruch Hashem, many of them, from having been in a very, very dangerous situation, and certainly would normally recite Birchas HaGomel. So the question is, what do you do over here? So on the one hand, you'll say, well, you got to wait, because you need a minyan. Just like you can't say Kaddish without a minyan, can't say Kedusha without a minyan, you can't say Birchas HaGomel without a minyan. So Shechter points out here that Birchas HaGomel is not a davar shebekdusha. It's not something that requires a minyan in the sense that Kaddish or Kedusha does. Rather, the idea of the minyan over here is because we have what's called Persuminisa. We have, or just like Persuminisa, just like when we want to publicize certain miracles, like the miracle of Chanukah and Purim, we want to do so in a public setting. So too over here, when expressing one's thanksgiving and appreciation, Akar Sato, for Hashem, for saving me and rescuing me from a perilous situation, I want to do it in the most public way. So if Shechter says, it would seem to me that doing this through Zoom or even a phone conference, he says over here, there's another funny word, a telephone, the conference call, it says over here, that would be sufficient. That would be sufficient. So this is interesting. Not every Sarah Chasara is the same. And it's an interesting point. When we say that you need 10, it's not always the same. Sometimes you need 10 because it's a davar shebekdusha, in which case coming together through Zoom or a conference call is not enough. However, when it comes to the need to recite Birchas HaGomel, preferably in the presence of a minyan, it's not a minyan in the most technical or the most common sense, but rather you need a group of people together. And if we're together virtually, that's also a togetherness. I mean, let's be honest. Right now, even though we're not together in a room, there is definitely a feeling. I mean, I have this feeling. I hope you do share it as well. That we're sort of together. I don't feel like I'm talking to myself right now. So that sort of togetherness, so to speak, you are able to fulfill even using Zoom. Okay, let's go on to another question over here. Okay, this is now some of these. I think the answer to, or maybe to many of these, the answers are sort of obvious. But I share this with you because I'm looking to, again, just sort of put together part of just the narrative, and to remind ourselves, not that we forgot, some of the very pressing and real questions that we had to deal with. This is a particular question that I received many times, several a month or two ago, and thankfully these questions have really been less frequent over the past several weeks, Baruch Hashem. And that is the question regarding being in touch with a hospital, with doctors or nurses, when there was a family member that was hospitalized during this time. Now, let's just take a step back for one moment. You'd say this is not a corona question, because unfortunately it's just part of life. There are often times where people have family members in the hospital, and so therefore there's nothing really so unique about this particular situation. That's not necessarily true. As a general rule, if a person has a family member who's in the hospital, if they think they're going to be needed on Shabbos, usually people will and perhaps should make arrangements to be there, not only so that they can be available without having to pick up the phone on Shabbos, but because more often than not, unless it's an unusual situation and it's a very, very long hospital stay, that people want to make sure that there's somebody nearby and there's a family member there that's there anyhow. But it does happen from time to time that a person is alone in the hospital. And if I would ever get a call, somebody say, listen, can I reach out to the hospital? Can I call the doctor? So I would say, listen, try to make up an arrangement with the hospital beforehand or with the doctor beforehand, that if they need you, they'll call you. What does it mean they'll need you? If there's a situation in which they require your input, if there's a decision that needs to be made and it could potentially be, a serious situation, most often when somebody's hospitalized, by definition already, that's called a cholish yesh bo sakana. It's unusual that a person would be hospitalized, admitted to a hospital, and we would say it's not potentially life-threatening. That would be unusual. So almost certainty it's a potentially life-threatening situation. So then it would be justified to pick up the phone if they called you. But to actually go ahead and pick up the phone and just to check in, so really that's not something you should really do. And if you really want to check in, then just go there. However, during the coronavirus crisis, so all of our local hospitals, and maybe hospitals all over the country, for all I know, were completely closed to all outside visitors, including family members. And lo aleinu, one of the most unfortunate and tragic and painfully tragic realities of this crisis was that there were people who died alone. And that's just, it's heartbreaking, heart-wrenching to realize that. But even those who are, Baruch Hashem, fortunate to survive and maybe were conscious throughout the entire experience and weren't intubated, they were alone. They didn't have family there with them. So now the question is, may I go ahead and reach out to the doctor and reach out to the nurses and just check in and call? And Rav Shechter said over here, absolutely. And the reason he said is because they are so busy and they are working so hard that there seems to be sufficient evidence, if you will, that the squeaky wheel gets a little more attention. Now, I recall as the process was unfolding, the reality is that most hospitals were telling people you can't call anyway, or you could only call at certain times, or we will call you. At a certain point, the hospital sort of took control of the situation, on that end. But if that was not the case, or until that was the case, the feeling was you should do whatever you need to do in order to be in touch to make sure that that whoever the patient is getting all of the care that they need. Furthermore, it was important for family members to be in touch with the members of their family that were hospitalized, almost for the same reason, because it's bad enough to be alone in the hospital without a family member, but if your health is compromised and you're alone and you're feeling distressed and very anxious in the situation, that itself is something that could be that could just further complicate person's recovery. And just without calling anybody out, just looking at some of the names and faces of people that are here with us right now, Baruch Hashem, on this on this call, there were people among us now who were in this very situation and could speak firsthand in a way that I can't about how important it was and it is to be able to have that sort of contact with family members, especially if the person is alone in the hospital. And so obviously every effort is made to minimize Chil Shabbos and Chil Yom Tov, but during these times, it was very common for people who had family members in the hospital to pick up the phone, to make calls on Shabbos and Yom Tov, whatever the case may be. And I'll add as well, even though it doesn't say it over here, but another tshuva Rav Shefter writes, and others did as well, to get in the car and to pick up a patient who was discharged on Shabbos and Yom Tov. There were members of our community who were discharged on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So you say, listen, you made it this far. You were there for 2, 3, 4 days or weeks, whatever the case is. So, stay another few hours. And the answer is absolutely not. Even if the hospitals would allow that, and most often they wouldn't, the halacha is you get out of there. And that's not only during, coronavirus crisis. I remember, hearing from Willig on many occasions that when a person is discharged from the hospital, they should leave. A hospital is not a safe place to be unless you need to be there, in which case that's the safest place to be. But then when you need to go, you need to go. You don't want people hanging around the hospital when there are germs and what else going on. So you tell a person, walk, they can't walk home. Take a cab, take an Uber, but we know that under the current circumstances, that's something that in of itself could be considered risky and unwise to have that unnecessary exposure to more people, not to mention the unsanitized situation in a stranger's car. And so therefore, the best option was to have a family member, obviously a Jewish family member in almost all situations, go ahead, be it a husband, wife, whatever the case may be, to go to the hospital to drive and to pick up whoever was discharged on Shabbos. This was done pretty routinely during this crisis. Here you have, I don't know, does anybody have any questions or comments? I'm doing a lot of talking here, which is totally fine with me, but I feel bad. This has become I'm going to stop for a moment. If anybody has any questions or comments or anything that you wanted to add or clarifications or anything, feel free to do so. I imagine you have the ability to unmute yourself if you want to. Okay, good. I guess is whatever we're doing is working. Okay, another interesting question over here. This comes from, you see on top of the page it says Minchas Osher B'Tkufas Corona. Rav Asher Weiss, who's a great and renowned posek, lives in Israel, who's been very influential in our community over the past 10, 15 years or so, has published many volumes of Minchas Osher. There he has Minchas Osher on the Torah and Shilos and Shuvos, and many other Sfarim, all part of his library of many, many volumes. Very, very prolific. As you can see, there is already one, but there actually, I think there are already two already at this point. But at this point, there was one volume in Minchas Osher, B'Tkufas HaKorona, specifically dedicated to questions and situations and memorim that were written regarding this time. This was published no more than 1 month into the crisis, and there were 200 pages. Like I said, there's been another volume since. So we're talking again about an extensive collection of writings and essays in response on this topic. So here you have a very, very interesting question. This is not something that I had. A question like this had not come my way, but very interesting. Is it permitted to go ahead and bring tefillin into a hospital if the hospital is going to be required that they be destroyed afterwards? You see that this question is coming from London, England, and the background to the story, which you could probably imagine at this point, is the policy of the hospital was that because of the concern of the spread of the virus, they said, listen, anything that comes in the hospital stays in the hospital. Obviously, with the exception of the patient, we hope that the patients will be discharged. But anything else that comes in is going to stay here. Clothing, belongings, it's not going to leave with you because they want to make sure to minimize the spread. Many of you have heard that about a week ago, the CDC, which is, and again, this is not this is not to be taken as a critical comment, but just something we've all observed, has on many occasions thus far, changed, revised, updated, and verse different opinions about different things. So we were told a couple of months ago that there was a lot of evidence that this virus is spread through surface contact. That has since been changed or reversed over the past week or so. But at this point, probably about 2 months ago, the feeling was that it would be a great risk to have anybody take anything in a hospital. So there's somebody in the hospital who wants his tefillin. The problem is if you bring the tefillin into the hospital, they're not going to come out. They're going to be destroyed. Is it permitted to go ahead and to bring them in knowing that they will be destroyed? So this is a very, again, it's a serious question, and it's a little, again, it's heartbreaking. To consider. So Rav Weiss points out that it's actually not a new question, that there was a machlokes, he said, from 90 years ago, where in this case it was a hospital that was dealing with the treatment of shachepet, which is tuberculosis. And again, obviously also a very contagious illness. And what they would do is they would burn all of the clothing and any of the belongings of the cholah when they would leave the Beis HaCholah. So they had a big debate about this as to whether or not we would deny or deprive the cholah the right to go ahead to wear tefillin as long as they're at the hospital, knowing that they would have to be burned, or not. So he points out that this was a big debate among the Achronim, and he writes at the end, there's a lot that I can say on this topic. Some felt that bringing the tefillin in the hospital in the first place would be like an act of destroying them, because that would be a necessary consequence. Says, I disagree on that point. I think that bringing them to the hospital is not considered to be an act of destruction. It's more like indirect. However, I agree with their conclusion that really you should not bring the tefillin into the hospital. He says, mitzvah tefillin gedolah v'chadiva. We know that mitzvah tefillin is a very important and very precious one. He says we have to strive to the best of our ability to see if there is some way that we can enable these cholim to be able to have their tefillin with them in the hospital and to wear them. Maybe there's some sort of arrangement that can be made at the hospital that they'll be cleaned or sanitized in a certain way that would satisfy their concerns. So like I said, this is not a question that came my way. I was not aware of local hospitals that had such concerns or such strict regulations regarding removing possessions from the hospital. But apparently, in London, this was one of the situations that was dealt with, and a very interesting tshuva of this unique time period. Here's a very interesting question, and Baruch Hashem, several of these. Now again, here also you had different policies among local hospitals, and they changed over the course of several weeks. But I mentioned already that the strict policy of all of our local hospitals, and maybe everywhere, was that corona patients were in complete isolation, and there were absolutely no family members that were permitted to visit. If you were in the hospital for another reason, and you were not, sick with corona, or not assumed to be, so then, generally still family members were not allowed, but there were some exceptions. Now, what happens if a woman was going into labor? Was she permitted to bring a family member with her? Normally, that would be a husband. Not always. Sometimes people bring another family member, mother, whatever the case may be. So, some of our local hospitals had the following policy, and that is that the husband can come, but he can't leave. Sort of like the tefillin, right? Eventually, they would let him leave, but not right away. So normally, in normal times, husband escorts his wife to the hospital. She has a baby. He leaves for a few hours. He comes back. He leaves again. He does carpool. He comes back. So the hospital said, listen, you're here. You got to stay here. You can't go in and out. Okay, so then couple has to make a decision. And in most cases, I imagine, he said, listen, we're going to go in the hospital together and we'll stay there until we could leave at the same time. Obviously, the hospitals also made every effort to discharge a woman after childbirth as soon as possible. So that was really rushed, and in most cases they were, after one night in the hospital, unless there was a reason to keep her, they would encourage her to leave. And again, that was really for her safety and for the safety of the baby as well. Now, the question over here, which was posed to Rav Weiss, was that there were hospitals. In this case, the question is coming from Ramat Eshkol, but there may have actually been, if I remember correctly, there may have been one or two hospitals here, I just don't remember right now, where also they would not allow the husband to go at all. So apparently here, in this particular shaila, that was the situation. So a woman goes into childbirth, goes into labor rather, on Shabbos or Yom Tif, and wants her husband to escort her to the hospital, even though he can't actually go inside. So let's say they live 2 miles from the hospital. He's going to get in the car. He's going to drive his wife, or they're getting a cab together, whatever the case is. He's going to go within the car just to say goodbye at the door. Goodbye, honey. Good luck. Call me when you can. So what's the whole heter for a husband to go to the hospital with his wife? The heter is because, during childbirth, she needs support, and we want to do anything that could, keep her, calm in order to make sure that the labor should go as smoothly as possible. So what would be the case over here? The husband can't really join her. He's got to leave her at the door. So Rav Weiss ruled, and again, I doubt that at this point in the conversation this is going to be a shock to anybody, but I think the question is just fascinating because the circumstances were so unique. He writes here on the bottom, near the cave of the cholaheter. The whole reason why a husband can go in the first place on Shabbos Yom Tov, this is all about, again, enabling her to be as calm as possible. Let's be honest. From a strict medical perspective, is this something which is necessary? There are times where husbands, just for whatever reason, they can't make it to the hospital on time. Somebody's away on business. It happens. The kevan shebekach meisvadaita, but it doesn't matter. The halacha says the fact that this allows her to be more calm. This is already considered to be a basis for pikuach nefesh, which would be matir chilul Shabbos. And by the way, since this is not really what I want to talk about right now, but just in general, since we're still talking about matters of pikuach nefesh and halacha, and particularly as it comes to the relaxing of certain standards, and to understand and to appreciate the extent to which the halacha recognizes and promotes pikuach nefesh, chilul Shabbos is not a small thing, but here, in order to allow, this woman in childbirth just a little more just peace of mind, so we would be matir chilul Shabbos. The Chidmudmani says, Rav Weiss, shebetkufa kasha kazu, kasha milvada daga hativa shel yoledes sheolech zebeis cholim yoledes yesh metach nosa v'daga yisera ikav machol hazu. In addition to the normal worry and concern that a woman would have when she's going to the hospital to have a baby, naturally she's going to be nervous. In addition, you have the additional worry having to do with coronavirus. Obviously, she would be, if it's in greater concern, so certainly the husband can escort her to the hospital, and that's what he needs to do. And that was Rav Weiss's ruling. Okay. Let's talk about another question that some of you may have heard about and been thinking about, especially as we are, again, hopefully getting closer and closer to the time when we will once again be able to daven together the minyan. And that is that there's a big question regarding all of the parshios. Oh, someone there? Oh, I got so excited. It sounded like there was finally a question. I'll stop again and ask if anybody has a question. Any questions? Okay. I'm just scrolling through some of the pictures of you to make sure that you guys are still awake. I'm seeing a lot of living people. This is great.
Rabbi?
Okay, good. Yes.
Rabbi, can the husband drive back home after escorting his wife on Shabbos?
Oh, excellent. So I just sort of jumped to the end of it. He says, Since they're not allowing him to remain near the hospital, they're basically saying, get out of here. וגם יש לחשוש שאם יש שם יסר על המידה, אכן יש בכך סכנה מסוימת מהידבקות. And even if they would allow him, having people just stand around doing nothing would be in violation of the recommendations of social distancing, and is something that could potentially be, again, dangerous. He said you can go back home, but really the husband shouldn't be the driver on the way back home. And he said, if he doesn't live that far, let him walk. So Rabbi says, listen, I am willing to allow the husband to drive his wife to the hospital. That's what needs to be. But once he drops her off, so it's true, under normal situations, we would say, you shouldn't even get in the car, girl. You shouldn't even take a ride by anybody else. But over here, since it's important that the husband get back home, go home. But now you would want to have a non-Jew drive you, or walk. So that's what he says. But the answer is yes, he could return home. In general, the question about a person returning from a situation of Hatzalah, I don't mean it in the technical, in the brand name of Hatzalah, but in a situation when a person is going to rescue somebody else or involved in Mazik Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbos, the question of going in the first place and returning is a separate sugya, and may depend on the type of situation and the type of professional we're dealing with, whether it's a volunteer, whether it's a person who's sort of a paid employee or physician, whatever the case may be. Over here, there's no question that the family member or the husband can escort his wife. Going back, there really would be no heter to do under normal situations, unless he would walk. But over here, since it's important that people get back home and not be hanging around in the streets near other people, so he permitted one to be driven by a non-Jew. Okay.
Can I just get sorry, it's Moshe Fruchter.
Sure.
Can I get clarification on the person who was discharged? You said a family member could drive them home. So why was that different?
So that's a very good question. So remember, Rav Weiss is talking in Israel, and the question that I was talking about was here in America. From day one, there were differences, many differences in terms of the level of concern. Although they really, really did lock down, maybe to a certain extent more than we did here on a governmental level in Israel, the numbers of cases that they were dealing with relative to what we were dealing with here, certainly in the New York area, very, very different. Over here, there was it was considered to be like a real a risk to ask anybody to get in a car with a stranger, as opposed to a family member, somebody who I was already living with, not to mention getting in the car of a stranger, etc. My sense is, from the way Rav Weiss responded to the question over here, and just sort of makes sense, just knowing the way things sort of played out there, was that the situation in Israel was different. I am inclined to say that, I can't be sure about this, but knowing the way Rav Weiss has dealt with many questions over the past few months, I've actually had the opportunity to observe that, close up on several occasions in several Zoom sessions, and participated in conversations with him. So I'm fairly certain that if there was a good reason for it, I mean, he would have permitted it as well. But I guess the circumstances in Israel when this question was addressed to him, and maybe really throughout the entire crisis, was such that it wasn't considered risky to be driven, by somebody else. But again, I can't be sure. But that was the situation over here. But here, I know for sure, poskim that I had discussed this with before those shilas came up, or as they came up, certainly said that it was permissible for a Jew or a family member, whatever the case may be, to drive on Shabbos Yom Tov in order to pick up if somebody who had been discharged on Shabbos. Once again, very unusual types of situations, because in my experience, which granted is not so extensive, but extensive enough that I could say, as a general rule, I always tell people, listen, if a family member goes to the hospital or needs to go to the hospital on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you got to get them there as soon as possible. But if it's possible to be driven by a non-Jew, then that's what we try to do. That's the that's the ruling of the Ramah and Shulchan Aruch, that when we can minimize Chilul Shabbos, we do. My wife went into labor twice on Shabbos, once on Yom Tov. Don't hold me to that. Once on Shabbos, once in Yom Tov, maybe twice on Shabbos. I actually don't remember, but at least 2 times. And both times we made arrangements beforehand to get driven by a non-Jew, because why not? There was no reason, why I needed to drive. And most often, that's what I would recommend to people. Certainly, if we're talking about a discharge on Shabbos, but the circumstances over here were very different. I say were, some would argue they still are different. I'm not going to take a position on that right now. Baruch Hashem, at least in my orbit at the moment, there is nobody who's hospitalized that I know of that is facing a discharge on Shabbos or Yom Tov. But if that is a situation that comes up, then it may it may still be a relevant question even here. Okay, we have 2 more questions that I want to address. I'm not even watching the clock. I don't know what time it is. I hope it's okay. Can we stick around a little longer? The truth of the matter is, it's been a long time already. I don't want anybody. I can't see you. All I can see is the screen that's in front of me. So if you start dropping off, I won't be insulted. I won't even know. So don't feel the need to stay if you don't want to. But for those of you who are awake and want to hear a little more, I have 2 more interesting questions. This one is a very different topic. It has nothing to do with hospitals or sickness or anything like that. But again, a very unique and obvious situation that we are facing due to the current circumstances, and namely the fact that we have missed many weeks of Torah reading, and the question becomes, what does that mean for us when this is all over? What are our options in terms of, or obligations in terms of making up missed parshios? There's been a lot written on this, and there are a range of views. One of the truths that I found on this, that I found to be very enlightening, it just he broke it down very, very beautifully, as he always does. Ramon, who is the posek of Alon Shvut, very, very respected and renowned posek in Eretz Yisrael. So he addresses this question in a very, very sort of thoughtful and a very insightful way. And he points out that we have several different machlokos, 7 different debates among the poskim regarding this question. So if you look on the bottom of the page over here, one question, he says, "Hi mashlimim parsha achas achora o ach kama parshos." The one question is, when we need to be mashlim, which means sort of make up a lost parsha, do we go back 1 week, or may we even make up several parshos? So over here, he says that the machlokes in the poskim about this, but Chuvas Mara mints sovashem mashlimim rak parsha achos. You only make up 1 week, and the Magen Avraham writes this as well. And so therefore he said, "B'mikra shalanu," in our case, sheyesh shtei parshos b'Shabbos anochachis yefshel lahashlim kili olam lo karim shalosh parshos. He's talking about a particular situation over here where they're heading into a double parsha and they missed the week before. So it says, well, that's it. We never make up more than 1. He says, Yesh sovim shesarach lashim gam parshas rabos. But there are other opinions who says, no, you can make up multiple parshios. Kitzarach lahashim es kol haTorah b'shana, because you have to finish the entire Torah at least once every year. Ubeneim, and included in those who say this, the El Yerabah, the Gra, the Chidar, Chashulchan, etc. Now he says, this is very interesting, just to sort of understand this a little conceptually. What is the svaras hamachlokas? What is what are the underlining reasons over here? So he says, Nitan lahavinj b'shtei tzuros madua mashlimin as a parsha sachseros. There are 2 ways to understand the concept of making up a missed parsha. Derech achas, one way to understand this is midin tashlumin, me'ein tashlumin shel tefillah. One way to understand it is it's like it's a make-up opportunity, sort of like we have by davening. The case would be if a person, let's say, if I forget to daven shachris one morning, so then I can make up a mincha. If I get that mincha, I can make up later Mariv. That's one way to understand it. Derech Shnia, another way is, Ein kan tashlumin klal. No, there is no makeup. There's no way to make it up. Ella merosh achovi hilikras kol Torah pam shana. There's an obligation to read B'tzibur, the entire Torah, once a year. V'chalukas haparshas and makevis. It doesn't matter how you divide that. We have a system that we follow, which basically tells us, okay, here's how you're going to do it. Here's the schedule for Torah reading for the year. But it doesn't have to be done on that particular schedule. So if we understand that what's happening over here is tashlumin, so then you can explain that there's an idea over here is you can only make up one. That is the concept by tefillah. If I sleep one day, I miss shachos and mincha. So I come to Mariv, I can't make up shachos and mincha. I can only make up one, the previous tefillah. More than one I can't do. That's the way tashlumin works. Why we're not going to talk about it right now. That's the way it works. However, if we understand, it says not tashlumin. Rather, there's an obligation to read the Torah once a year. So obviously, you got to make up everything that you missed, and it's not tashlumin. We're not bound in that way. So that's very, very interesting. And then he talks about other related questions that come out, and what happens if, let's say, some members of the community heard a parsha and other people missed out. You know, which, by the way, is also almost relates to a separate question as to whether or not Kriyas Torah in general is a chova upon each and every individual, or is a chova satzibur, right? You know, an afkamina would be, let's say I missed Kriyas Torah one day, when, you know, in normal times. So do I have to try to find one later, or you say no? It's, you know, it's a chova on the tzibur, not on the yachid, not on the individual. So that, you know, relates to this question. The Maseh, he says at the conclusion of the tshuva, I don't want to read through everything because it is getting late. There's a lot more information here. He says a general rule, it is not necessary to go ahead and to make up more lost parashios. However, it's a good idea. If you have people who are willing to, what does it mean willing? Meaning, it could be what we call a tirchad tzibur. I think our last Shabbos in Shul was Parshas Tetzaveh, right? So Kisisa Vayakal Bakudei, the end of Sefer Shmos, the entire Sefer Vayikra, and, you know, we've now read Parshas Bamidbar. So it's hard to fathom, but we've already missed, you know, a serious chunk. I'm not going to mention people in our shul who I think are qualified, if we really, really held them to it, to actually go ahead and to read this in one shot. But it would probably take, I would say at least an hour, but my guess is more. Maybe it'd take an hour and 15 minutes. It would take a long time, maybe an hour and a half. It'd take a long time to read all of that. And so if this is not something which is required, it's not something that we would impose. But if there is a group within the tzibur, the entire tzibur wants to, so then certainly would be the sort of the proper thing to do. I would say, forgive me for my commentary because you didn't ask, but in the normal circumstances, you know, I think many people would, I hate to use the word dread, but would dread, you know, having to hear such a long Kriyas Torah. But under these circumstances in which we have been denied the opportunity to be in shul for so long, once Be'ezus Hashem we are able to reunite as a tzibur and to do that, I would imagine that we would be more than patient and even eager to have the opportunity to go ahead and to fulfill, if not the obligation, but at least the whatever kiyum there is in making up all the lost parashios. Another discussion which Rav Shechter has in this related tshuva is how that can be divided, or how that should be done. Should it be done all at once, which is divided over several weeks? He talks about what happens if you have a bar mitzvah boy who, let's say, prepared his parsha. Obviously, there were a lot of bar mitzvah boys who prepared their parshios. You know, it took them a year and a half to prepare, and unfortunately, they did not have the opportunity to read it. But Tzibor, when we're making it up, how we would incorporate that in the process of which haftarah you read. So very interesting related questions. We'll get to one more. Oh, this is a biggie, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm actually not going to because I'm really going to, what time is it now? We're going to finish Bli Neder within the next 5 to 10 minutes. But this is another very, very big question. There's a lot written on this. I stumbled upon this probably, I don't know where I saw this, but there's a halacha journal, as you see, Beis Havad, which talks about family business and Jewish life through the prism of halacha. So over here they're talking about issues having to do with contracts that were, that were prepared and that were signed between two parties, and because of the circumstances of the coronavirus, so people were unable to, to provide, to offer all the services that were promised. So what does that mean in terms of the contract, in terms of commitments, in terms of, payments, and we're dealing with schools in terms of tuition payments. So over here, they analyze this from a contractual perspective and talk about whether or not schools are entitled to, are required to return tuition money or entitled to continue to collect tuition money. And they get into somewhat of a technical question of contract law according to halacha. And they end up at the end saying that even without any specific stipulations, if there's a prevailing minhag regarding tuition obligations, that would override the default halacha, which is an interesting idea when it comes to contracts in general, and that is that minhag plays a very, very strong role. Obviously, they acknowledge that this is not really going to be the case for coronavirus, but the question would be, do we view the pandemic as merely one example of an extraordinary one, of a school closure due to onus, and therefore governed by minhag or not? And they didn't really address this question. Rav Shechter, however, and with this we will conclude, did deal with this in a very, very, I think, a very sensitive and an interesting angle that he took. And he did so by first mentioning the concept of yizkor. He says yizkor is something that could definitely be said without a minyan. This is something that we did Pesach, and it's something that's going to be done again tomorrow, or if you don't want to do it before Yom Tov, so on Shabbos, when yizkor is recited without a minyan. The primary, the main part of Yizkar is the neder tzedakah, the pledge for tzedakah that a person makes. The b'chol Yom Tov yesh mitzvah simcha, and the Rambam says chayv adam lios bahem sameach v'tov leiv. And when a person is ocha v'shoseh chayv lahachil ger liyasam la'amonim sharon niyam amulalim. When a person is enjoying the festive meal of Yom Tov, one should include other people who are needy and disadvantaged and don't have all of the privileges that I do. And if a person fails to do so, says the Rambam, that's not truly Simchas Mitzvah. Klomar, says Rav Shechter, an important part of Simchas Yom Tov is to gladden the hearts of those who are less privileged. That's exactly why there are all these collections that we know that exist before Yom Tov so people can have what they need. That's why we say Yizkar, in order to be of an extra benefit for the neshama of the one who has been lost. And then he quotes the pasuk, Staka tatzil mimaves, the pasuk that tzedakah is something which is a great zuchus, which protects us from lo aleinu, from death. And now he says, can you imagine there were people who were prepared to spend a lot of money on Pesach hotels? And it is proper. Any money that was not paid, it's right that they should give it to tzedakah. This is the time that, there's going to be a need. There is a need, and there will be an ongoing need for people to be offered assistance. And then he gets into questions of whether or not there's a concept of ona, which means, whether, if a person charges more than the market value for a certain object, let's say, so it is subject in Jewish law to sort of review, and if it's person charges too much, so that nulls the sale. However, the nira, but he said, but that doesn't apply when it comes to things like that involve great tirchan preparation. And you'll see where he's going in a moment. In our case, Be'ela shemenalim tachniot miyochados b'maralim Pesach. A person who is organizing a big Pesach event, where a large percentage of their of the money that is collected is for labor, and some of it obviously is for the actual overhead and the supplies and the food, etc., like that. So they're certainly entitled, talking about refunds, they're certainly entitled to keep a certain percentage of the money that was given to them for the tircha, for the effort that was expended. And, you have to try to figure out what that is. And he says, obviously, people who invested and were preparing for these programs lost an extraordinary amount of money because they've already paid a lot of money, a lot of deposits to vendors and to hotels and the like. And so therefore, he says we have to try to figure out a way to do what is reasonable, what is fair, by recognizing and appreciating that we all need to sort of compromise together, which is a very nice approach that he takes. And we shouldn't be obnoxious about it. We're saying, well, I never ended up going to the hotel. I never ended up, using your services. And so therefore, I'm entitled to a complete refund. He says, the Gemara tells us regarding the Jewish people that we are Rahmanim Baishanim and Gomlei Chasadim. The Jewish people are known to be, and this is something which is not merely descriptive, but sort of inherent in the types of people that we should strive to be. People who are generous, people who understand and recognize that we sometimes have to go lifnim ashuras adin. We have to act in a way that goes above and beyond what is technically required. And now we said is especially a time that people should be generous to the extent that they can. And then he says at the end, this is really the last paragraph. I've heard that there are parents who are now demanding refunds from tuition. So, well, I'm paying for all this. I'm paying for all these Zoom sessions. I'm not interested. He says this is not something which is tenable. This is not really fair or reasonable. The ina yeshivas yicholos l'shalim maskoros amalamdim case. As it is, it's going to be very difficult and challenging for schools to be able to continue to pay their staff and their teachers. The ina maspik safim, and if we go ahead and start withholding tuition payments, then literally will not be able to make payroll. How then can we go ahead and demand that they give money back? Facing the current situation will cause yeshivas to close the door down. Everybody's losing here. As Moses HaTorah, we have to try to do the best we can to support Torah institutions. So of course, Shechler is not denying the fact that there are some real realities that we are facing at the moment. There are situations that are going to, be hopefully not permanent, but for the foreseeable future, challenges that we're going to have. And there are real questions and conversations that the community has been having regarding costs of tuition in yeshiva education. These are important questions. But we're talking right now about the moral, ethical, if not halachic obligations to keep commitments and to recognize that if everybody just goes in and pulls out and says, well, I haven't been receiving, so therefore I don't need to give. So this is something that will potentially cripple the entire system and God forbid, cause, a further breakdown of the infrastructure of the community, which we have to really try to the best of our ability to support, especially at these difficult times. So here you have, again, just a small sample of some of the many unique questions that we have faced and our poskim have had to deal with over the past several months. I hope that you found this to be interesting, maybe even meaningful. And remember, as I said before, I hope you'll share my inspiration when we realize and appreciate the incredible merit that we have as a community to have people who are so committed to halacha that they continue to ask questions as the needs arise under these very difficult circumstances. And Baruch Hashem, we have been blessed with our poskim who are able to guide us and instruct us accordingly, even through these very unusual and really unprecedented times. I thank you all for learning with me. I thank you. I never would have imagined that when we scheduled this program on the eve of Shavuos, that we would have, I guess I'm included in the 47, that I would have 46 people learning with me at almost 1 o'clock in the morning. So thank you. Ashreichem, and once again, thank you to all of those who organized this evening's event. It was obviously very well attended. I hope appreciated by all, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. A good Erev Yom Tov to all. Thank you.